Hi, I'm Alex Rodriguez. I'm the president of the Wharton Club of South Florida. We are the premier networking and business education alumni group in South Florida. And I'm very pleased to have everyone here today, specifically the alumni in South Florida, Boston, and the various undergraduate and MBA students who are on this event. So to that extent, I'd like to introduce someone very important, our host, Michael Elkins. He is a 20-year employment and sports attorney, as well as a sports business podcaster. He's been featured in publications and quoted by the media such as CNN, Forbes, the New York Daily News, and Newsweek, as well as other national outlets and employment sports-related legal issues. Michael is the founder of the law firm MLE Law and the host of the Quarter Four podcast, which covers the intersection between business and sports. Michael?
Thanks, Alex. Thanks for having me, everybody, and welcome to our panel this evening, Inside the Business of the NFL. I want to first start off by talking about one of our lead sponsors, Sports Epreneur. I actually use this group. They're some of my good friends. They actually did my website, and the company covers the intersection between entrepreneurship and sports with a very high-end content platform. So if you're looking to push content that talks about your business, but also brings sports into it with a little bit of passion, some flair, and something a little different, then Sports Epreneur is definitely for you. And you can find Sports Epreneur at sports, S-P-O-R-T-S-E, the letter E, .io. That's sports, the letter E.io. Now let me introduce you to our panelists. Our first panelist is Michael Lombardi. Michael is a former NFL general manager and three-time Super Bowl winning executive. After 30 years working for the New England Patriots, San Francisco 49ers, the Oakland Raiders, and the Cleveland Browns. He writes a column for The Athletic and hosts his own podcast, The GM Shuffle. Lombardi is also the author of Gridiron Genius, where he provides the blueprint that makes a successful organization click and win, and the mistakes unsuccessful organizations make that keep them on the losing side. We're really pleased to have Michael here as part of the panel. Our second panelist is AJ Vaynerchuk. AJ is the co-CEO of Vayner Sports and oversees the company's entire operation. In 2009, prior to founding Vayner Sports, he and his brother Gary Vaynerchuk started Vayner Media, an advertising agency. While working on Vayner Media, AJ was an active angel investor, counting Uber and Venmo as part of his successful startup portfolio. He's currently a proud board member of the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. Thank you both for doing this while we're in the heart of NFL free agency. I know this is a busy time for both of you. And also want to give a shout out to the Wharton alumni who are on this call and on this panel from all over the country, including South Florida and Boston. Thank you for joining us as well. So AJ, I'm going to start with you. It's NFL free agency. You guys have a lot of clients that have been out there. I know we're maybe not in the thick of it anymore, but a lot of talk about the salary cap dropping. What have you seen in free agency here in 2021?
Free agency has definitely been interesting. It's been pretty fascinating for us. We had two of our clients, Leonard Williams and Allen Robinson, receive the franchise tag. Obviously, we got Leonard's deal with the Giants done, and Allen is still under the tag. He's recently signed that. A few other clients of ours have signed. I would say probably the biggest trend that I've seen, maybe as a reflection of the decrease in salary cap, and I haven't crunched the numbers, but I feel like a lot of players are coming back. I've seen a lot of players re-sign on one-year deals. Obviously, the one-year deal concept is pretty rampant just because the idea that the salary cap should bounce back. And so I think those are the two themes that I've seen the most, just in terms of a lot more players staying home and a lot of players, opting for, the one-year opportunity so they can get another bite at the apple once the league and the salary cap recoup some of those dollars lost from the pandemic.
Right. And so, Michael, from the executive side, you handled free agency for, 30 years or however long it's been around. What have you seen here in the 2021 free agency group?
Well, I think this is probably the unique market that's ever been because of the players and the owners are partners in the deal, and the players have suffered through the COVID losses, and we've never seen a cap decrease. And it's really was unfair to everyone that there was no planning, that who could have expected the cap was going to decrease, So this was truly the only market that I've ever seen where there were teams working desperately to get below the cap that really weren't involved in free agency. So it was truly like what we learned at Economics 101 in high school. There was huge supply, low demand, and that caused the market to really have a huge variance. I think the deals, now AJ did a great deal with Leonard Williams, and there's a lot of great deals out there. But I think on a whole, I think most agents would agree these deals are probably 20% lighter had this been a market where we had a cap that increased. If we had the new TV contract and everything was staying pretty much the same without COVID. This has been a depressed market, and the teams have benefited from it, those that had the cap room.
So, you mentioned about the market and market efficiency. So I'm going to ask you, Michael, first, and then turn it back over to you, AJ. Michael, you wrote in The Athletic, and you talked about it on GM Shuffle, about the concept of, teams having must-haves, needs, and wants. It was in the context of the Patriots. But I think there's an interesting discussion to have there, both in the NFL, but in business too. Can you expand on the must-have, the need, and the want concept from the executive side?
Yeah, I've been really fortunate in my NFL career. I've worked for some really talented people, and obviously Belichick and Al Davis are two that come to mind, Bill Walsh. But when you're an end, and when your business ends or the quarter ends, and you have to evaluate, you have to do an autopsy of what just occurred. You got to collect that data, and then what you must be able to do is you got to ask yourself the question: for us to be successful, what has to happen? And that goes into what we call the must area. If we don't get this done, if we don't satisfy these needs, we're never going to be able to compete next year. And then you have the want area. Well, we want to improve in this area. The need area. We want to improve in the need area. We have a need. We could play the way it is, but we need to get better. And then we have the want, which is like, we need to get a better punt returner. We want one, but maybe we'll not be able to get there. So what teams try to do, and Al Davis did this, Bill Parcells did this, which then gave it to Belichick, is you set up a category of, okay, for us to compete next year, we must have these 5 things. We need these things. We want these other things. And you just start working off your list. It would be the same principle for any business. What must we do to achieve success next year? Those are the 3 things. What do we want to do next year to achieve? What do we need to do?
So AJ, let me ask you kind of the same question, but sort of from like the agent perspective, right? When you're looking to put your players in certain places, are you looking at teams and saying, here's their must-haves, here's a need, and how does that play out for you guys on the agency side?
Yeah, I think it depends on the player's success up until that point. I think, if you take a player that has been extremely successful in their career, I don't think you're looking at the team's depth chart per se from the player's perspective in terms of their opportunity to be successful. I think you do look at it from a leverage perspective to understand, okay, to what Michael just described, if this is something they must have, that gives you the opportunity to maybe squeeze extra dollars out of them. I think when looking at a team's must have, want, and need, it becomes particularly relevant, I think, at the next levels below the blue chip free agent, because especially like I mentioned this year, if you got a player that is taking a 1-year deal, you want to see what system do I fit in? What depth chart looks good to me? What are the opportunities? Do I believe I can go in there and excel? And so I think you are looking at those things. I think it's just from a different lens. I think blue chips, you're looking at it from the lens of how to negotiate the best contract. And then for other players, I think you're looking for the best opportunity to be successful with the idea that maybe you can parlay that into a better contract. So that's how I see it.
So, Michael, one of the other things you mentioned recently, I can't remember if it was on GM Shuffle or in The Athletic, was the concept that free agency is a lot like Wall Street. I think you talked about Warren Buffett. I was wondering if you, and to me that fits right in line with business and sports, like colliding. If you could talk a little bit about how you view it from an asset management Wall Street perspective.
Well, I mean, it really is. We're talking about, you have to evaluate a player is no different than a stock, right? You've got to evaluate them. You got to put the actual grade on them. AJ's job is to make as much money for the player that he possibly can. It's not to make the team, to do a friendly deal for the team. It's to make the most for his player. You as a club representative, you got to improve your team but you also have to make sure your finances are in order. So you can't overextend yourself. So I always viewed my job as a little bit like a bank loan officer. If I go and pay AJ's client way too much money and he can't back the services, I may be able to satisfy my must list, but I'm going to have to get rid of this player in a year because he's just where I'm leveraged too far out, and I'm not going to get the return on the dollar. So, and then you've got to be able to play a calculated game of chicken, right? Every agent will tell you, I've got 3 more teams interested in the player. You've got to figure out, is that true or is that false? They're going to tell you, I've got 3 deals better than this one. You got to figure out whether that's true or false. You've got to kind of play the game. Okay, how do teams think? How do they behave? Like I'll take an example. Dory Jackson just signed a huge contract with the Giants. And everybody wrote in the paper the next day that, well, he had a lot of big, the Eagles were going to be a team that was going to be strong and contend for him. That's just, if you fell for that, you're basically going to lose your poker hand really quickly, because there was no chance the Eagles were going to go pay $39 million over 3 years for a player who's been played in 2 years, who's only had 7 passes broken up, who can't stay healthy. Could you imagine them going to a press conference and saying, we just signed this guy when half their team was hurt last year? So you have to be like that. You've got to be very analytical. And as Buffett did, you've got to know all the teams that you're competing against and how they think and how they behave. So it's really, and that's where Belichick gains such a unique advantage, because he sees it through a broker's eyes. He sees it through an investment banker's eyes. He never falls in love with the stock. He only falls in love with what the number is. AJ wants you to fall in love with the player. He wants you to be desperate. And so you'll pay him more money. If you have ability to have an appetite and we say, no, I can't do that. That's we're out on that. Then you become a better deal maker. There's certain, Buffett doubled down on Amazon. He bought it at $18 a share. He bought it at $1,800 a share. Sometimes you got to pay for things, and sometimes you just have to walk away from things.
So AJ, from your perspective, right, on the agent side, I would imagine you're trying to drive up market value. So if you could maybe talk a little bit about how you're viewing things from the sort of Wall Street valuation lens, but on the agency side.
Yeah, I think that to Michael's point, the thing that I have found, because my career did not start in the business of football, right? My business started more in Fortune 500, more companies that were on the stock market. And for me personally, what I found to be such an advantage in the business of football when negotiating on a player's behalf is you just have this world of data, and it's all out there, right? I can look up what a team has done, what a general manager has done in terms of how they've spent at a position, the contracts they've done, the timing of those contracts. You're able to pattern behavior and look at that, and you're able to do that across all 32 teams. So that's such a big leverage point. In other forms of business, there is no directory, there's no login for the NFLPA and the union to see all these public contracts, right? For example, my first business, an ad agency, when I was negotiating with Pepsi or Unilever or General Electric, I wasn't able to go into some log and see every contract they've ever done with every vendor. But in football, you have that. So I think that's a big advantage. And I think data and analytics is important. I think it does play similar to a stock market in that regard. And yeah, like Michael said, of course, there are tactics, there are leverage, that you could do. It's a game of poker. But I think the biggest advantage is every transaction that a team does is on the record, and it's public and it's accessible. And I think if an agent understands how to take information and process it, that's a huge advantage in this business.
So when you're looking at the information, AJ, and you're trying to analyze where the deals are you from the agency side? I think a lot of people always wonder who reaches out to who first. I mean, how does that happen from the agency side? Is it you wait for the team? I mean, or is it
case by case?
Case by case.
It's case by case. I think you're going to have situations where teams will reach out on players, and you're going to have situations where you're reaching out to the team. Every situation is different, and the pacing of that conversation and the communication is highly dependent on the situation. Tough to put that into a one-size-fits-all category.
And Michael, go ahead, Michael.
The job AJ had this year was that, and I think a lot of agents made this mistake because the market was so depressed this year. There were teams trying to sign players to contracts. I know, a lot of teams. Kenny Golladay got offered a huge deal in October, by the Detroit Lions. He turned it down because he felt like there was going to be a better market out there in free agency. And that market never showed up. I think sometimes players, this is a challenge for the agent, is to convince a player to take a deal when there's no other deal to take. And this market was really, this market was that. That's why we're seeing a lot of one-year contracts, because players want to get back into the market again. They want to work, but they want to get back in the market. There's no money in this market right now. And I think the challenge this offseason has been to understand when you must take a deal and when you should pass on a deal. If I were doing a deal with AJ and I knew, there were very few teams that were going to match my number, I would give them, say, AJ, you got 3 hours to make this deal. If not, it's off the table. Now you're going to.
Shifting gears a little bit from the market efficiency side and the agency side or the contract side, talk a little bit, and Mike, I'll start with you from a culture standpoint. A lot of organizations, and you talk about this, they fail on the culture side. And I'm sure, AJ, you've seen that in some of your business dealings as well. So, Michael, if you could talk a little bit about culture building that you've seen in the National Football League and how that might apply to some of the business owners we have in our audience tonight.
Well, I think the biggest issue is in football is they don't really understand it's about culture. I think that's the hardest thing to get through, is everybody thinks it's always about talent, and talent wins, but you need the right talent and the right culture. And so whenever you have so many people involved with the team, making decisions on player acquisitions, the culture element gets lost. It's what do we represent? And when you're represented by a lot of people making decisions, you really don't have a culture. And so there has to be, this isn't the Dave Clark Five. This has to be a paramilitary organization where someone brings the culture in, and then everything feeds off of that person. And it typically should be the coach. But too often in the NFL, we have too many executives or presidents that want to control the player procurement, which then affects the culture. It's really challenging to do. The players feel like they don't work for the coach. It becomes a very challenging job. I think this is, why the Dallas Cowboys, as successful as Jerry Jones has been in terms of making money, he's yet to be able to get a culture in that building other than when Bill Parcells was there and other when Jimmy Johnson was there. He's yet to have a culture because he doesn't really want a culture. He wants to be involved. He wants to have that. Challenging thing to do. And I think in sports, it's even more challenging because everybody wants to say it's an intoxicating business. Everybody wants to be part of a winning, successful team, but they don't understand that culture really matters more.
AJ, how about your thoughts on culture building? I mean, you've led numerous businesses, obviously involved in startups and tech. Your thoughts on culture building and sort of how it maybe transcends from sports to regular business?
Yeah, I take great pride in the culture that my brother and I have built across numerous organizations over the last decade plus. I think to Michael's point, the benefit that we had is that my brother has such a big personality and has such strong conviction and beliefs in what he does and has such talent that I think our culture really embodies him. And it's very clear, as far as where it stems from, where it comes from, it trickles down from the top. And I think the other benefit is that culture is one that has a good combination of, work ethic, kindness, innovation. And so I think that's a dangerous, trio to put together. If you can have something that, you can get 1,000+ people aligned around the idea of being hardworking, being kind, and being innovative, there's a lot of good results you can get from that. And so I think to Michael's point, one thing that I found interesting looking from the outside, just being in this agency, whether it's a college program or a professional program, I do think sports is even more challenging, just because you have some dynamics that may not exist in other forms of business. So for example, I think a very interesting dynamic, and it takes a very special coach to accomplish this, is for a coach to coach players that make more than the coach financially, right? I think a lot of people will measure power and success from the economics that they earn in an annual year. And, you've got football coaches that are consistently managing and coaching and driving the ship, where they have employees that are younger and financially further along. And I think that's a dynamic that is not very common in traditional business that exists in sports. And, you see it quite a bit in basketball, you see it in football. And so I think that's a dynamic that sports, you have players that make more than the GM and the head coach combined. That's a dynamic.
I think you see that too when coaches, I think, make the transition from college to the National Football League, right? I mean, the college coach certainly is earning significantly more than any of the players. And that we could go on that tangent for a little bit. But I'll ask both of you, do you think that plays a role in certain college coaches having trouble when they transfer over to the National Football League, that dynamic of the finances?
I don't know if it's as much the finances as, when a coach runs his college program, he doesn't really have anybody getting in his way. He's the general manager. He's the president. He's the owner. The AD barely says a word to him. Colleges, as long as we win and the stadium's full, we're doing good. In pro, some owners, they want to have a say in analytics. They want us the personnel guy is going to work for the owner, and, the coach works for himself. And there's this constant civil war that's going on. I mean, in 1984, Bill Walsh, my first draft, and I've written this in Good Iron Genius, and I say it all the time. We were at 12 rounds in one day, and it started at 5 a.m. It went, and we're in, I think we're in round 10. And I was kind of buzzing around the room, and he's like, what's your problem? And I said, well, he said, look, Michael, we're only competing against 8 teams. There's a 28-team league. We're only competing against 8. This is when we were 28. He said all the other ones, they can't get it right internally. They fight a civil war. And I think that's really what happens more than ever. College coaches don't have that civil war. They don't. They build their program. They have complete autonomy to do whatever they want. Now what I think happens to them a lot of times is they stop coaching football. They get hired and they're paid to be the best coach on the staff. And then they stop coaching. They just walk the sidelines. And I think that's one of the biggest mistakes they make because, they got to go to this alumni meeting. They got to go to this dinner tonight. They got to do this. If Nick Saban's not doing that, Nick Saban's working on football. Dabo's working on football. So you got to, it's your schedule. It's your calendar. You got to fix it. College jobs are, the University of Texas is a better job than 10 NFL jobs. Central Florida is probably is a better job than a lot of college jobs and maybe even a few pros. You make really good money. You're going to get kids to go to school there. You're in a conference. I mean, I think the NFL is a challenging job because of the civil war that's involved.
AJ, your thoughts on the college coach making the transition to the NFL from a sort of a business standpoint?
Yeah, I think Michael makes a ton of good points. The one thing I'll throw that I think is going to be really interesting and will shed a light on, what makes it difficult and what doesn't is I think college coaches' jobs are about to get a lot harder once name, image, and likeness really hits its stride. It's going to take some time. We'll see when it all comes to fruition, but you're going to have players in your program making real money. And I think one of the things from my perspective that college coaches have the benefit of is they have a little bit of a leash on some star players because they realize that the star players realize that the coach has the ability to hurt their financial future, right? If you're a kid in the pre-draft process and if you didn't really follow coach's program, that can hurt your draft stock and that hurts your pocket. When you've got college kids making 6 figures and 7 figures through name, image, and likeness, just monetizing through marketing and endorsements, I think that's going to bring a whole new wrench. And even to Michael's point, it may introduce a bit of a civil war amongst the players that has never really existed in college football. And I think that's going to be a really, really interesting dynamic that'll take 3 to 5 years to start to play out, but I think it's going to be there.
It's interesting that you brought up name, image, and likeness. I actually had on my podcast Chip LaMarca, the Florida state representative, who introduced the name, image, likeness bill that was passed here in the state of Florida. I think we were the first state to pass that bill just ahead of California. And I think you're right. I think you're going to have major changes coming as those laws start to become more prevalent in various states. We got our first audience question here, and I want to remind everybody who's listening, if you're watching on the YouTube channel, you can use the chat box there to ask a question. So here's the first question. What's your point of view of matching cap and cash versus pushing cap charges into the future through upfront signing bonuses and roster bonuses? I'll put that to you first, Mike. You want me to repeat that?
No, I got it. Cash to cap, that's an interesting conversation. So really that never is going to be consistent, right? Because, your cash expenditure 1 year is always going to be higher than what your cap is. And so eventually over a 4-year period, it should level out. What I think you really want to make sure you don't do is you want to be able to give yourself a chance to to not overextend yourself and be always doing what I call the wimpy thing. Gladly pay Tuesday for a hamburger today. When you get into that wimpy thing in the NFL, you get into a lot of cap trouble. The Rams have done it. They've been able to get through it because Kroenke's spending a lot of cash over cap. But at the end of the day, no matter who the owner is, he wants to basically in 4 years have his cash aligned with his cap, just by the system, the way it's going to do it. So when you look at it on a 1 year basis, on a line item basis, 1 year you're going to be cash over cap. The Cowboys, for example, the last 3 years have been below cash over cap. But now this year, because of Dak's contract, they'll go way over. It always evens out. You just can't make a living going over that number. What you can't make a living doing is making mistakes. You can't do that. You can't have Jared Goff traded. You can't have all these, Carson Wentz, and then someone. You can't have $50 million of money taken away from your cap. Because this cap's going to go way up. It's going to continue to go up, and the players are going to get a lot of revenue from it. But at the end of the day, as this cap is increased, there's really not enough talent to really eat the cap up. I've always contended the head coach's salary should be in the cap. He should be part of the cap as well, because they should be paid more because they're running a $300 million cap, let's say. They're running it. They should be part of it. But, that's something that's hard for the people to really understand.
Cap issues?
What's that?
I said, AJ, your thoughts on the same question? Yeah, no worries.
Yeah.
On the cap issues?
I think Michael covered a lot of good ground. I think it goes actually also back to the whole concept of must have, want, and need. I think there's a lot of mechanics that can be utilized to push the cap charges down. I think you're seeing it a lot this year. Feel as if the extra years added for the void years, were used more this year than in a lot of other years. But you've seen other teams utilize it. I think on the agent side of things, depending on the player that you're representing, you're going to hear that. So, for example, if you have a blue chip player, I think the team is going to figure it out, and they're going to use void years and whatever they need to do to get under the cap if they feel like you're a must-have. If you're a want, this might have not been the year to be a want, just given the cap issues, and that's maybe why you're seeing a lot of if you're a need, this might have not been the year, and you might have lost out compared to other years. And if you're a want, cap issues, it's a luxury. We got cap issues. But I think if there's, a player that is truly upper echelon, the owner, depending on the owner, Michael made the point about the Rams owner, there's other owners. That's the big point, is you just need an owner that's willing to spend the money at that level in order to have the cash go over the cap. And that's when you can get into void years and things like that. So I think it speaks back to the point we were talking about earlier in terms of the different levels of players. And I think that really speaks to how the cap versus the cash goes down case by case.
So one of the things that I think that came up earlier, it might have been from Michael, was that the cap's going to go way up eventually. And so we saw some spending sprees here in free agency early. Obviously, the Patriots were the big one. I'm wondering, if Michael, start with you and then over to AJ. Are we seeing these spending sprees because teams like the Patriots are seeing that they may look like big spending sprees today, but in the future there's going to be this significantly larger amount of money that's going to help make up the difference? I was wondering if you could speak to that.
I think the Patriots' really concern is the 2022 cap. Of everything they did this year with the cap room, they had to make sure that whatever the contracts they did, they had enough going into next year, and that they could sign draft picks in 2022, but also keep the players and not have to redo deals in 2022. We know the cap will go up slightly, not as much as people are suspecting, but in 2023, the cap's going to go way up. I mean, it's going to get back to normal, assuming everybody gets the Johnson & Johnson shot and we have people in the stands and all that, and revenue's coming in. So, you have to have a 12-month and a 24-month cap strategy. I think most teams will have that. And you got to be right. I mean, you got to have the personnel guys got to be right. You got to find 2 or 3 college free agents every year that you have for 4 years at cheap numbers. You got to hit on a mid-level pick. You got to hit on the second round picks are the most vital picks to hit on, because you get a 4-year contract that are really economically friendly, and those guys should be starters. I mean, if you could trade, your first round pick for 3 twos, you should do it every year. They're just really good, solid players. You don't get Mel Kiper eyes because you take a guy in the second round that Mel thinks you should have taken, early. If you take a guy in the first and Mel doesn't like it, you got to listen to him bitch for an hour, And so you just basically you can kind of use your draft the way you want to do it. So not that I think Mel's right, and I certainly don't, but I'm just saying he's got a platform to complain about it, and then you got to listen to it, and then it drives the story. It does. It's like the greatest thing of all is people make fun of these deals. The Patriots overpaid. Yeah, the Patriots overpaid, right? But do you even know what the deals are? AJ doesn't give the deal to Adam Schefter what the real deal is. He gives it what it can earn mostly so he can help his business, right? When the deals come in, Cam Newton signed for $14 million. When you look at the deal, it's $3.5. But all we remember was he signed for $14, right?
Right.
It's the narrative. And so the part of the whole conversation is to make sure you can control the narrative. And by having second round picks, you do a much better job, which helps your cap going forward.
And AJ,
Michael makes a great point. Something that we don't really partake in, but is rampant in our industry, is what I like to call monopoly money. It was, I think, a $50-something million contract. He was cut after 1 year because of the structure of the deal. And so I think that's a big part of it. As far as the cap goes, I think from the agent's perspective, this year was a tough year from a cap perspective. Next year should be better. And then not only is next year better, but to Michael's point, expecting that big lift 2 years from now, next year is better, but it's also 1 year closer to a big spike. So it's even double better in that regard. Right. If double better counts as a term.
So we've got a couple questions, and then I'll get you guys out of here. I know we have to be done by 8:14, I promised Michael. So one of the questions is, why do you guys, either one of you, why do you think teams are going younger and making their coaching decisions? I mean, we're certainly seeing that trend, and someone in the audience asked the question. I'll put it to both of you.
I'll let Michael go first. I think he's better suited to answer it.
I think that look, when you want to have control of your organization, you hire inexperience. You don't want somebody to tell you no. You want somebody to come in that's going to do what you want them to do. Experience in the NFL is nobody cares about it. They don't care about it. It's that, I'm probably more qualified to be a GM today than I ever was in my life, but I'm too old. I got too much experience. I would tell somebody he's full of crap. That's not really a smart thing to do. They don't want that. They want a lot of background singers. And so when you want background singers, you're going to have people that are young, and they're going to be willing to learn, and they're going to be you got to live with their mistakes. I mean, I think Sean McVay is one of the best coaches in all of football. He's a young coach, but he's made a lot of mistakes. They're willing to grow with them. He's made a lot of mistakes in personnel. We can go through it. Sten Jared Goff's contract, Brandon Cooks, Todd Gurley. There's a lot of money walking out the door, but he's a really good coach. But will you pay a price for an experience? Peggy Noonan wrote a column years ago about, we've outpriced experience. And I think she's right about that. And I think the NFL, it's cheaper to go younger. And it's also to be able to get people to do what you want is easier to have somebody who's younger, won't rock the boat. AJ, you have any thoughts on the trend?
Yeah, I think another aspect, I think what Michael says is fair. I think another aspect too is just human nature as a society overvalues the unknown. I think we always look at draft picks, right? We're constantly looking at how great they can be. But more likely than not, they won't reach that ceiling. There's only so many transcendent players or transcendent coaches. And I think the other point I'll make too is in the NFL, in sports, mistakes are unavoidable. So from, I think, an owner's perspective, if there's this really alluring, young, hot coaching candidate that you could see could be the next McVay, so to speak, there's plenty of coaches with 10, 15, 20 years of experience that make just as many mistakes. I mean, you've got front offices and coaching staffs with massive experience that make an enormous amount of mistakes. You can't not make mistakes in this business. It's too much of an art, not enough of science in a lot of ways when it comes to personnel.
So something that you mentioned that struck me as you talked about mistakes, AJ, and I'm wondering if you could address this. A lot of times people are reluctant to admit their mistakes, and I think we see that in sports quite a bit. But from a business perspective, can you talk a little bit about maybe the importance of not only acknowledging the mistake, but maybe moving on from it?
Yeah, I would say I say this all the time internally to my company because we're a startup and we're fast growing. We're less than 5 years old. We're up to 4 different sports, 70 something clients. Like we're moving quick and we're making mistakes. It's impossible not to make mistakes. But my personal motto is the only mistake that really bothers me is the mistake you don't learn from, right? So I'm big on, okay, we made a mistake. Let's not move on per se. Like, of course, we want to move on mentally, but let's digest what happened. Let's have a grown-up conversation about what happened. And let's figure out a game plan so we don't make that mistake again. Because if you're an organization that doesn't allow history to repeat itself from a mistake perspective, you're only going to get exponentially better. I also think that people appreciate when people are willing to admit their mistakes. I think it's when a CEO or a leader admits that they made a mistake, I think it garners the respect of an employee or a client. I think the nice thing for most privately held businesses that a sports team does not have the luxury of is when I make a mistake in my advertising business, in my venture capital business, in my sports agency, as long as it's not too egregious, that's not showing up on, the front page of the newspaper. It's not trending on Twitter. If you're a GM and you whiff on a first round pick, you never hear, Michael mentioned Mel Kiper. It gets even worse than that when it ends up actually being bad, right? And so I think that's a tough thing for sports executives, that you are just getting hammered. And then, depending on the town, if it's a small enough town or a passionate enough fan base, you can't even go out to dinner without hearing it, right? And so that's tough.
Yeah, I mean, especially like if you're the GM that drafted, Mitchell Trubisky ahead of Patrick Mahomes. Michael,
I get blamed for drafting Jamarcus Russell, and I wasn't even in the room. I got idiots on Twitter that say, what are you talking about quarterbacks for? You drafted Jamarcus Russell. And I'm like, look, dude, that wasn't even in the room. So like, don't even go there. You can't, one thing you can't do is win on Twitter. You can't, those people are geniuses with erasers, so you can't, but you're right. I think the one thing you have to do as a leader is, especially in the sports industry, is because if you live off your mistakes, you'll die. So what you have to do, instead of making fun of Ryan Pace and what he did with Mitchell Trubisky, which I have made a lot of fun of, but I'm outside the league and I get paid to critique it, is to really, why did he make that mistake? Like, analyze where he went wrong. If you go back and listen to his evaluation of Trubisky, he was wrong from the beginning. I mean, everything he evaluated was completely wrong. And so you as an executive, you constantly have to analyze the mistakes by other teams, not to make fun of them, not to Ben Bradley used to tell everybody at the Washington Post, don't gloat, because he didn't want, even after they had Watergate and they don't gloat. You don't want to gloat that you didn't make it, but you want to learn from it. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think that's critical. I think in any business or whatever you're doing, it's important to learn from your mistakes and make sure that you acknowledge them, as opposed to just sort of letting your ego get in the way, right? I mean, ego is the enemy. I think we've all sort of talked about that. Look, I think this is a great place to cut it off. I want to make sure I get you guys out of here on time and respect your time. So first of all, thank you to both of you for doing this. I'm super appreciative, both personally. I think the Wharton Club is appreciative as well. Thank you to Wharton for putting on this event, the Wharton Club of South Florida, to all the attendees, and especially thank you to Sportsepreneur. Make sure you check those guys out. You can find them on the internet at sportse.io. Great company, great people. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and thank you to our panelists. Have a great night, everybody. Thanks.